Hi, sensitive souls. It's your girl, Brittany Shanae, the highly sensitive healing artist. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk a bit about being highly sensitive and having deep emotional wounds. Now, emotional wounds can be seen as trauma, right? Also, they can just be things that we simply have learned to believe about ourselves. They may not necessarily have been traumatic experiences, but um, wounds that masquerade themselves as self belief. And so when I say that, a lot of us who are highly sensitive have grown up in households that didn't really understand our sensitivity. Culturally, we aren't necessarily in a society that understands and embraces sensitivity well. And if you were in a home that kind of followed suit in that, whether it was in terms of like the general social culture or whether it was just in your particular racial or national culture, depending on what your particular situation is or was, you may come from a background that saw sensitivity as weakness, you know, um, and that can be very, very challenging. Now, why that may not necessarily come off as traumatic, um, if we are embedded through our upbringing with certain ideas about what our sensitivity mean in a negative connotation, this can have a huge impact on how we view ourselves, and how we view ourselves shapes a lot of how we feel, and then how we feel shapes how we behave. How we behave impacts how the world thinks and behaves in response to that, and that can create situations that can lead to wounding experiences. So for instance, in my own story, because of my own personal dynamic in my upbringing, I was considered too sensitive. I was teased for being reactive. I had periods of time where I was bullied by both people at school and also family members. And while some people thought it was all in good fun, for me, it was really, really, really challenging to be in environments that didn't understand. For me, no meant no. Like, no, I don't want to be tickled. No, I don't want to be hit. No, I don't want you to talk badly about me. No, I don't want you to tease me about this thing that I feel very personal about. And to be in environments that don't heed your no, you learn that people don't respect your no, or that you have to respond in even more erratic ways for people to take you seriously. But even then, the world has different ways that they respond to that sort of erratic behavior. While for you, it is a defense response or a mechanism for you to self protect, right? Which can mean you can become hyper vigilant about things, or you become super passive about things, because you know that when you're reactive, either people use that as fuel for them to also be reactive. And that can be a challenge as well, where you feel like, well, I'm just going to show you that I'm just how serious I am. And other people take advantage of that to make you look like a villain, or to use that as a way to say, see how this person is crazy, or see how this person is unstable in some way. And that can be an extremely hurtful experience. The way that this wounds us is that it has a way of drawing us away from our authenticity. And authenticity is important for every human being, or every living thing. Anything that's not living in accordance with its own truth is generally scarred in some way. And it can have some very deep and intense implications for our lives and for our well-being. And when we're not authentic, again, it just tends to create a cycle of essentially self violence. And then we end up in this behavioral pattern where we're wounding ourselves because of these beliefs and these feelings and these learned behaviors due to the conditions that we were brought up in, or due to traumatic experiences that we've had to face. Because we're highly sensitive, our processing is different. Because of our neurodivergence, we feel things more deeply, we feel things more intensely. And so the way that we process things, or the way we need to process things, is very specific. We require a lot of alone time, but if you are in conditions that aren't very considerate of your highly sensitive nature, you might not have been allotted that, especially for those who maybe grew up in big families, or even, let's say poverty, if you have many people living in a small space, or if you're in communities which are really, really tight knit culturally, that sort of, seem to be founded on this idea of like love is being up in your space, and that may not feel safe or secure for the highly sensitive person, even if it is culturally accepted. So it's important to look at all of these things and how they impact our ability to take care of ourselves and the things that we learn as we get older. We either settle for conditions that tend to repeat the situations that we grew up in, or we just become, again, hyper vigilant about how we move forward. And that hypervigilance can often be very repelling to people, and that can cause a lot of discord when we're trying to have healthy relationships with people. And we essentially end up in these situations, as I was stating before, sort of wounding ourselves. We choose people who perpetuate our pain, who play out the dynamics that we may find ourselves in that don't really serve us. So it's a common thing in psychology. And I remember studying this in school when I was receiving my bachelor's, that we all tend to repeat the patterns that we learned in our parent-child relationships, even if our parents weren't around. That abandonment or that feeling of being discarded or left or betrayed in some way can have a way of repeating itself or playing itself out in our relationships. We expect people to abandon us, or we act in ways that cause people to not be able to handle us because we are either super clingy or again, hyper vigilant within the relationships, where we just feel the need to hold on so tight and to really grasp at this sense of control so that people don't leave us, or we feel like, well, if I do this, they won't leave, or if I'm manipulative in this way, whether it's more materialistically manipulative or emotionally manipulative or physically or sexually manipulative, whatever it is, and we try to seduce and reel people in as a way to sort of safeguard us in our emotional comfort, when really it's not a healthy relationship pattern. It's not a healthy emotional pattern for us to have sustainable relationships in. So it's important for us to be cautious about these type of wounds. Another thing to be cautious of as a highly sensitive person is because we are most naturally empathic due to our nervous system wiring, our neurodivergence. We care often, even when we would rather not, which means that when we are woundedness, we do tend to have we have a tendency to gravitate towards people who we feel like need our help. And sometimes this can be noble, right? This can show up in the way that we give back to communities, how we show up in our families in caring and attentive ways. However, when we're not careful and when we're coming from a place of woundedness, there are those who would seek to take advantage of that. And typically these people are deemed narcissistic in some way, and maybe they're not clinically narcissistic. They can be, but they might just have narcissistic tendencies, or in a moment maybe in a narcissistic state in terms of how they behave. I know that that's one of those like buzzwords right now where everyone's just kind of being labeled a narcissist, and that could also just mean that it's more prevalent. Things are becoming more exposed, and we're recognizing how much all of us have been negatively impacted by the state of our society, as all of the dysfunction in our systems are starting to come into the light. And so while some things may seem like, oh, everybody's this and everybody's that now, it's very possible that we have all been scarred and have all been negatively impacted by the state of our culture, the state of our society. And I'm speaking to really the world, but I can only speak firsthand as someone who is an American citizen and someone who is also of Black culture. And that is probably a great topic for a different video, but I won't get into that right now. It's important right now to really be mindful of our wounds, of our beliefs about self, and where we learned to believe certain things about ourselves. Our brains are fantastic machines, the most powerful and magical machines ever. as far as we know. Maybe dolphins have us beat. I don't know. but when we really think about the human brain and how wonderful it is at understanding patterns and connecting things, whether or not they should be connected, should, but it helps us to be able to compartmentalize or to make sense of the things that we're experiencing so that we can safeguard or protect ourselves down the road. And so it's also just an important feature of learning, right? Is the more information we get, the more we're able to connect the dots. And when we really look at a lot of things, everything is so interconnected. But we have to be mindful about what beliefs, what thoughts come of these connections that our brains are making. And because these connections can again lead to these feelings that cause us to act in ways that create our reality of woundedness, or to dwell on a past wound and in an attempt to address that wound either out of safety or out of some idea of what it is that we deserve, we play right into that belief. And so one way that we can begin to sort of heal these things about ourselves is just to be mindful of our thoughts, to sort of take note about what it is that we think on a daily basis. One way to take note of that is your self-talk. How do you talk to yourself? Are you someone who generally has a lot of negative self-talk? I'm too this, I'm not enough that. And if that's true, where did that language come from? Where did you hear that? Is that something you heard on television, on the radio, if people still listen to the radio? But definitely in music, any form of media. Is it something that you learned in your household? Is it something that a teacher told you, a friend? Just be mindful of the things that you hear. So if you're finding that you're having a challenging time with negative self-talk, be graceful with yourself. Understand that if you've been living in a certain pattern for a long time, it's going to take a minute for you to reel that in and to build momentum in a more positive direction. So show yourself some grace, give yourself some time, you'll get there. Also, be mindful of who you keep around, right? So yes, definitely be mindful of the obvious. Like, don't have people around you in your life, whether you're related to them or not, that tend to perpetuate these negative thoughts. They like to tell you about yourself, tell you negative things about yourself. But also, there are people around you who might also have negative self-talk. They talk badly about themselves, right? Then it's going to be very challenging maybe for them to be a positive example in your life. And so if they are on the path of having all of this negative momentum about their own views and feelings about themselves, then it's going to be very challenging for you to step outside of that. So it's going to be really important for you to start surrounding yourself with people who are self-empowering, are looking towards self-improvement, who are more rooted in positivity and doing the work necessary in order for them to change where they are, right? I'm not saying that you have to have perfect people around you. You're not likely to find perfect people. Nobody is that. But it is extremely beneficial to have people around who are very serious about the inner work, who are reflecting on their own thoughts and behaviors and making significant efforts to change in a positive way. Another way to begin to sort of address your wounds is to write things down. Just start writing down your day-to-day experiences. That's one way, just to become mindful of what your thoughts are. Be mindful of what's happening in your day in and day out, to just notice like what's influencing me from the outside. Maybe it is something that you watch. Maybe it is something that you listen to. Maybe it is something you're telling yourself. And just being mindful of it may not be enough, especially if you're not used to being in that mindful space. Developing a writing practice and journaling on a regular basis has been such a cathartic experience for me. I've had a lot of deep revelations through my writing practice, and also because I also tend to express myself through poetry, I find that there's a lot of depth in my experiences, even if I'm not totally conscious of it. Sometimes unconsciously I'm experiencing something and I'm not realizing how it's impacting me on the conscious level or on the emotional level. So a lot of times, especially if we're used to being in spaces where we have to suppress ourselves and how we really feel because it's not appropriate for us to fully express our emotions. Again, writing is extremely helpful. Just start getting familiar with how you feel, what emotions tend to come up for you, or if you are in a challenging time in your life, what is your relationship with your emotions? What's your relationship with anger specifically, or sadness, or joy, or anxiety, or if you're going through what you feel like is depression? There's a lot of things. Some woundedness isn't so obvious. It's not really obvious that we're wounded in a certain way, right? We may not realize it until we start ruminating about something over and over and over and over again. So, again, catching your thoughts. One way that I discovered that I was wounded and I didn't realize it, it was actually with our good old American healthcare system. I had a gynecologist who I was seeing because I was diagnosed with endometriosis, which is basically it's an overproduction of estrogen that was leading me to experience some really severe symptoms with my menstrual cycle. And the endometrial tissue in my uterus has outgrown it and created a lot of scar tissue. And this makes me a high risk pregnancy if I were planning to have a family, which my husband and I were at the time. Still something that we're on the fence about because of this situation. And I realized it was because this particular gynecologist instilled so much fear in me about me not being a normal person. And I didn't realize how wounded I was when she said that. I had shared with her that I had thought about, me and my husband were thinking about moving overseas. And she says, "Oh no, you can't do that. You don't want to do that because, they may not have what you need in order for you to have, what's necessary in case something goes wrong with your pregnancy because you're not a normal person." And I was like, I was ruminating over that for a long time. And then I really had to sit with the feelings of that, of feeling like, why aren't I a normal person? And why am I not going to be able to make certain choices of my in my own life because of this? And after sitting with it for a while, I realized that I did feel very wounded. I felt wounded as a woman. I felt wounded as a person living in this body. I felt wounded that she maybe didn't communicate that in a way that made me feel more at ease. And then as I started to do my own research, I also recognized that what she said wasn't necessarily true. There are people all over the world who might experience difficulties and abnormalities in their health and in their bodies, and they're doing just fine. Again, it's important to recognize who you have around you and the type of speech that they use, because this will impact you as a highly sensitive who is more prone to absorbing the emotions and the ideas and the feelings and the reactions around you. And because we're so great at interpreting things at a level of depth, right? Because that's one of the staples of being a highly sensitive person, is that we experience things with a great depth, and we also experience the subtleties of things at a great depth. And because we're processing all of this, it's so easy to ruminate on negative things, which only brings us down energetically. And this in itself can have a negative impact on our health and well-being. And so it's so important for us just make and find practices that allow us to just become a bit more self-aware about what's causing us to feel wounded. Now, woundedness is not a permanent thing, right? Like, if you are wounded, it's not necessarily permanent. There may be scars there. There may be some things that don't necessarily feel the same way that it did before it was ever wounded. But there's also a lot of wisdom in woundedness. Me as a highly sensitive person, I have never grown so much as when I have from being emotionally scarred by something, by some event in my life. Some of these things were, I wouldn't necessarily call them trauma per se, but they were just really hard phases of life, which we all go through as we get older, whether it's losing a loved one, or whether it's friendships ending, or whether it's moving to a new state, or a certain career venture not working out. So many different things that can happen. For those of you who are parents, maybe just witnessing your children growing up and recognizing that, like, oh, they're not going to be babies forever, or that they do have their own autonomy, and maybe that autonomy has nothing to do with your plans for them. There's so many things that can challenge us in how we feel, and these things can create what feel like wounds for us. But again, there's so much that we can learn about ourselves ourselves through this. And that's another reason why I tend to harp on emotional well-being and emotional awareness. Is because if there is a particular emotion that continues to keep revisiting you, or if there's an emotion that you feel like you're not in good relationship with, that is a an invitation, I believe, for you to explore yourself on a level that maybe you haven't before, or maybe just in a way that maybe may feel new to you. Because, say for instance, and I love using this as an example because I'm such a Ted Lasso fan, and there's a character by the name of Roy Kent who is known for being the angry guy on the team. But his anger, while it did often get in the way sometimes of, say, him having healthy relationships or him being able to move on from certain things, it served him in a way as well. When he was in good relationship with it, it served him well. Particularly in his art, which in this particular case, it was soccer. But also it was he used his anger to stick up for himself. He used his anger to protect his loved ones. He used his anger to say the things that people were thinking, and maybe he was the only one who said it, and he was the embodiment of what other people were feeling but just didn't know how to, or were afraid to say it. It's important to just analyze our relationship with our feelings as it relates to these different events in our lives that may have granted us an experience of feeling wounded, because it's an opportunity for us to learn about ourselves a little bit more closely. The last thing that I want to say about woundedness is be careful about labels, okay? Particularly as it relates to being diagnosed with certain things. It was several years back, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. And this was by a physician. Now, the physician didn't really know me well, and I knew that I was struggling with something, but I didn't know what it was. And maybe by this time, you could say that I had generalized anxiety disorder, right? And it definitely felt right when I did my own research and looked at the symptoms. There was definitely a lot of accuracy to what was described as GAD. And I know that I've also had my bouts with depression in the past as well. However, when you are a highly sensitive person, or if you're a neurodivergent person who experiences a lot of depth, and you're in environments that are not suited for you, that don't cater to you and your particular way of being, it can lead to a sense of overwhelm and sadness and poor well-being. And if it doesn't feel safe for you to be authentic in those environments, the only thing that you can do is to resort to doing a whole lot in order to fit a different mold for the sake of survival and acceptance and love, which are basic needs that you shouldn't have to bend yourself out of shape for. But because of the way things are, it's a very common thing for us to do as highly sensitive people. Or we resist so strongly or feel so beaten down by the circumstances that we completely shut down. And this is also our body and our nervous system's way of saying, I have been so overwhelmed for a long time that the only thing that I can do to keep myself okay is to completely turn everything off, because I've been feeling it for so much for so long. Our bodies are not meant to be on fight or flight for long extended periods of time. And because of the levels of stress that we experience in this day and age, which is more than any time in history that it's been for humans, right? For a number of reasons, which is also probably great conversation for another time. We have to understand that our bodies are not meant for that. And so generally speaking, it would need to shut itself down so it can self-preserve. This means that we can easily be diagnosed for anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, bipolar depression, and a number of other things, when really, if we just took the proper care of ourselves based off of the knowledge that we understand about what it means to be a highly sensitive person from a physiological, biological, but as well as an emotional and spiritual standpoint, this gives us the upper hand. This allows us to create a lifestyle that actually works for us in our nervous system, instead of trying to make something work that's not meant for us and causing ourselves to constantly go through the cycles of up and down and up and down and up and down, which is not sustainable at all. I say this from firsthand experience because I know how stressful it is trying to figure out how to make yourself fit in a space that doesn't work for you. It's definitely a square peg, round hole type of situation. And it's wildly uncomfortable. And it not only is extremely limiting in terms of your internal life, it's extremely limiting in your external life. A lot of us aren't able to adjust to what the world is asking for of us, not in the way in which we've been taught how to show up. And so if we take the time to get to know ourselves, then we can become more equipped, and then we can begin to address the wounds that are there, and then to stop perpetuating the behaviors that would create more wounds for us to have to heal and address. So I hope this is helpful for you. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you like the video, please like it. If you like this type of content, please let me know in the comments what more you might like me to talk about in regards to being a highly sensitive person and what you think would be helpful for you to hear. I love sharing information about all the things that I wish that I would have known when I was much younger. But let me know what it is that you want to know. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Much love.